Okay, I would like to, you have talked about the normalization process that United States has started a few years ago. And frankly speaking, the achievement has been incredible. The performance of the US labor market has been extraordinary. And as you said, the unemployment today is the lowest in 50 years, from mid-60s. So, and the inflation is about the right level of inflation. So I think this has been a tremendous achievement. And at the same time, you were saying that you need to go to this neutral stance. Of course, neutral is very difficult to define. And perhaps the first question would be, can you help us how to think about what is a neutral stance in the future? What is a neutral interest rate level? Because this is a very vague concept. How we know that we are there is always a difficult question. But frankly speaking, I was very interested in your speech, and I liked particularly a lot that you introduced something that sometimes, and from my perspective, is missing in monetary policy perspective, which is the fact that you have to keep an eye, not both eyes, but at least one eye has to be looking at financial stability. And you mentioned directly that you are considering also not just the path to get equilibrium in the labor market and in inflation, but also financial stability. So perhaps a second question, the first one would be how to get this neutral concept. The second one would be if you could explore a little bit further the financial stability risks if this continues for too long, which was one of the two sides, and you wanted this balanced approach on the basis of being very prudent, very gradual, and data-based. So these would be my two questions on the first part that I would mention, which is this very important normalization process that you have started and other countries will start or have about to start very soon.
So as I said in my remarks, neutral is where, well, I didn't actually say these words, but this is what I meant. Neutral is where we're not accommodating, we're not pushing the economy to go faster, but we also don't have our feet on the brakes, right? So we're not trying to restrict activity, but we're actually trying to let the economy stand on its own. Now, in terms of what that is, usually when you hear people talk about the natural rate of inflation, technically people call it R star, they talk about it as a range, right? Yeah. The range that my staff tells me that the models are suggesting is somewhere between 2.5% and 3.5%. Right, so we're not at 2.5% now in our policy stance, so that tells me that there's still room to move. Once we get in that range, this is where I think observation and data collection and intelligence gathering becomes quite important, because we want to have signs. Is the economy still showing extra momentum, or is the economy starting to contract in ways that suggest it might not be prudent to go further? This is where data is clearly important. But one thing that we do in Atlanta that I think is quite special is we have this RAIN network. I have a team of staff who get paid to go meet with CEOs, meet with community leaders, meet with workers, and ask them in real time, how is the economy working for you? What are the stresses you're seeing? What are the challenges that you're facing in trying to accomplish your business objectives? And what that gives us is a real-time picture of how the economy is being experienced. And we incorporate that into my understanding of how the economy is working and my understanding of how our policy is actually working. And so I like that outreach because in many instances, economic trends start happening before they show up in aggregate data. And so to the extent that we can detect some of these trends in advance, early, then we can deploy the appropriate policy in real time and not have the economy get much further out in one way or the other and lead to more volatility. So I think that my goal is to act, wait, watch, and learn, and then use that learning to figure out how much further we should go. But there is going to be some art there. Your second question was on financial stability. So you started by talking about housing.
Yeah.
And I was a housing economist at the University of Southern California, working on credit quality and credit risk. And then the crisis happens. And when the crisis happened, it rippled through the financial system in a way that I had not been sensitive to even the possibility. Then I went to Washington and then tried to help clean it up. And then I became much more sensitive to the possibility because the proliferation of risk through the system was so complete and so poorly understood that we had put ourselves at risk. So one of the lessons I learned from that is that we always need to be thinking about this, and we need to think in unexpected places. We need to look in unexpected places because before the Great Recession, housing in the United States was not viewed as a leading indicator of anything. It was viewed as unimportant. You didn't have to pay attention. The important stuff was happening in other places. And that was wrong. And so we should take from that any place can be an important place, and so that we need to look in every place. And that's what I'm encouraging my team to do. And as I see things that come up, I talk about them early, because we need to make sure we're aware of all the trends that are happening.
What would be, from your perspective, the role of monetary policy in helping to avoid this kind of bubbles or situations or imbalances in the housing sector? Is there a role?
So there is some role. One of the reasons why I think normalization of Federal Reserve policy is important is because the price signal should give people a sense that there is cost to borrowing, that there is risk associated with certain activities. And when interest rates are too low or so low, then those risks might be underweighted or undervalued, and it could lead people to take actions that are more risky than they understood, or than they understand, or more risky than they can actually survive. Right? And so to the extent that we use the price mechanism to signal the presence of risk, that's a good thing. But there are a bunch of other things that also need to happen for housing to make sense. Some of it has to do with regulatory structure and making sure that banks and brokers and realtors and investors in securities are all following the procedures and processes that need to be followed, but also questions about compensation to make sure that the way that people get paid doesn't introduce incentives to just do any transactions without a consideration of risk. One of the things that came through the crisis that I discovered was that there was almost no one who got paid to stop a deal going through, right? And in that context, what's going to happen? Deals are going to go through. Like crazy deals, and the circumstances and the risk associated with them was not important to the agents because they didn't get paid based on whether that transaction lasted for 5 years. They got paid if we could do the transaction tomorrow, right? So to the extent that those types of rules can be amended to change the incentives in ways that there is a much more focus on the performance of tools and products, I think we can be better. But that's not a monetary policy function, right? That's a broader regulatory function. And so it's important that the whole system understands the reasons why we had problems so that the whole system then responds in a way that tackles them.
Yeah. When I moved from Spain to Washington, it was in 2006, and I remember the realtor telling me, this is the time to buy. I mean,
I'm sure
don't
they did.
Rent.
Right.
This is the time to buy. Don't miss this opportunity. This is a great... No, I didn't.
So you're smart. That's good.
Let me just ask a little bit more on, because I am very interested on that part, which is how to integrate financial stability into monetary policy. And I think you have reflected a lot. Is that reflection formalized in some way at the Federal Reserve? I mean, is there a way that you have made progress in internalizing this kind of analysis of financial stability into your actual decisions of monetary policy?
So yes.
Yeah, good.
So coming out of the crisis, the Federal Reserve didn't have a division of financial stability. We created one. So now there is a division of financial stability whose job it is just to monitor all the parts of the financial sector so that we are aware of trends and developments in that sector, and we have authority now to examine and explore and do things that we couldn't do before in this context. In terms of monetary policy, we are presented with reports from that group before every meeting. And so we have a sense of what the state of financial stability is in the United States and how capital flows are happening. And I will tell you, I go around and I talk to a lot of people, and questions and issues of financial stability come up all the time because many businesses were scarred because the financial sector didn't work. Many communities were hurt dramatically because the high-risk mortgages and underwriting that happened led to foreclosures and blight in neighborhoods, like many communities. And so this is something that is still on people's minds, and I see that it's shaping their activities as well. So we talk about this a lot. And one thing that's been, when I started at the Fed a long time ago, the idea that there was a close link between bank supervision and regulation, or basically looking at the financial sector, and monetary policy, it was understood, but I don't think it was really understood. Coming after the Great Recession, I think it's understood much more deeply, and there is an intersection, there is an interaction, and we can't ignore it because that contagion can be quite important.
That's very good, positive development. It's not easy, but it's very important. So if you don't mind, we can move now to the international environment. United States is well advanced in the cycle. Other countries are not so much. You are well advanced in this process of normalization. So perhaps a few questions. The first one would be, how do you internalize in the monetary policy the international outlook? How what it is going on in the international scene influence your own policy decisions?
So just like we have for financial stability, we have a division on international economics as well. And they report to us on developments across the globe and their implications for the U.S. policy, the U.S. economy. So we are very sensitive to developments here in the Eurozone. The Brexit has got our attention, and the financial implications of that are significant. We have very significant interest in emerging markets because one result of our policy changes has been a shift of capital across the globe, and that has implications for risk and support and sustainability of particular economies. So we think about all of those things. I've been pushing my team to give me as much guidance and insight as to what extent are we destabilizing other places, and to what extent is that destabilization likely to swing back and affect the U.S. economy. And so we definitely have those conversations. It's an important thing for us to be mindful of. And frankly, I think that many of the developments that we've had in terms of our policy changes that have an international context has also got our attention around this. So things about trade and tariff policies and renegotiations and the impact that has on businesses, if we don't fully understand that and appreciate that, we will, I think we'll be surprised in very bad ways. So I'm trying to avoid being surprised and trying to stay on top of things as much as possible.
Now that you have mentioned tariffs and these things.
Well, I figured you were going there anyway.
Yeah, I was going anyway, but you brought it. So could you give us a little bit your expectation and what is the impact that you think is having? Obviously, we have been in a very strange situation in which inflation was not there, was not anywhere. But one of the reasons probably is globalization. There may be other technological reasons, other reasons. But one of the things that could could also influence the expectations and inflation path could be if there is some trends in terms of tariffs or trends in terms of more protectionism. So it has implications from many different angles. It's not just trade, it can have impacts through many channels. I would like to see how you think about it and to what extent this is already happening and to what extent, for example, tariffs are influencing prices in the United States and how this is incorporated in your own thinking at the level of monetary policy.
So tariffs, the theory is pretty clear about what happens when you have tariffs. Prices go up, right? And we are seeing prices go up. I will say they go up with a lag, right? So the way that tariffs have been introduced in the United States, there's an announcement that there may be a tariff in a particular area, and then there's a 90-day comment period. Over that 90 days, businesses are not just sitting on their hands. Right, so they know that if there's a risk that there's going to be tariffs, that they better get as much of their input as possible at the pre-tariff price. And so we see businesses actively working to increase their inventories, buy goods at the cheaper prices, and then just hold them so they can produce that way. Because of that, it takes the time required for them to work through that inventory before you see it in the final goods area. And the experience this time suggests anywhere from 3 to 6 months can pass before that will actually show up into the marketplace. And so in many regards, we have not seen the effect of tariffs in the United States in final prices. Another piece to this is what tariffs have been chosen to be placed on and the size of the tariff. So many of our tariffs have been at the 10% level. And most businesses that I've talked to tell me we can maneuver around and manage 10% without having to affect big changes in terms of how we price. If we go to 25%, which is one of the proposals, the businesses have told me, the leaders have told me, that's a game changer for them and that they will have to pass on prices much more directly and aggressively. So we haven't seen impact on prices yet, but we're not at the end of the game. And we're going to keep our eyes open to see how policy shifts, and then that will inform how a lot of business leaders act. Now, there's another piece to this which you don't see a lot in the news, but I think is quite important, which is the introduction of tariffs. This whole transition of trade policy has introduced a lot of uncertainty about what the rules of the game are going to be 6 months from now, 12 months from now, 24 months from now, and beyond. And so when we talk to business leaders, they say, I have some investment options, but I have no idea which one to do because I don't know what the rules are. And without knowing what the rules are, I can't rank order them in terms of which is most effective or most profitable. And so business leaders in my district, at least, are stepping back and saying, we're going to wait. We're not going to invest. We're going to hold back until we get a better sense of what the rules are. And so when you think about sustaining economic growth, when you think about increasing levels of productivity in the workforce, we need these investments. We need businesses to be willing to invest. And so one of the things that's happening is that this is pushing it out. Now, depending on the reactions, it could just be a delay, but in some instances, the cost structure of the business model might change such that some investments don't happen at all. I have no idea what the outcome is going to be. We'll just have to wait and see how it all plays out and what solutions businesses have to the new environment.
Very good. Well, I have just started to receive some of the questions from the floor. There is one theme that now that we are in the international discussion, I think there are some questions that will require us to go back to domestic policy, but let's get this international environment. One of the themes that is in the question is you have been in this normalization process. What could you tell, what tip could you give to the European Central Bank that is starting now in the process of moving to higher rates? What have you learned in this process that could be useful for the European Central Bank?
I think two tips come to mind. Two. The first is communicate, communicate, communicate. Be fully transparent on what you're trying to do, how you're going to do it, when it's going to start, and be repetitiously boring, right? So when I started in my job, my staff has really said, never say the same things in a speech twice. That's wrong in this space. You need to say it 400 times and make sure that everybody understands it at such a level that it's just understood. Because we tried the normalization process in the balance sheet once before. We did not take that strategy, and the bond markets were unhappy. And we had to reverse that. The reversal was painful, and it really pushed us back in terms of our policy 2 years. So getting that communication function up and running and robust and repetitive is critically important. The second tip I would say is start small and watch. Right, so one of the things that I think is important to remember is that the whole quantitative easing approach, the whole approach to increasing using the balance sheet as a tool, was unprecedented. Now, we had not really done this before on the way up, and so it's hard to know in advance what's going to happen on the way down. Right, so doing things dramatically on the way down when you don't want the action to have a dramatic input or impact doesn't seem right. And so we go very slow, very small. We put out a formula. Everybody knows what the formula is. Everybody knows when the stuff is going to happen. And because they're small, the incremental impact has been small. And you don't even see the markets really respond to this at all. And my expectation is that if the ECB can do the same, start small, but monitor and watch, because we had the advantage of being first, right? So the cumulative impacts will be different in the ECB case. So they're going to have to watch more carefully. We're all going to have to watch as this moves forward. But just putting it on a formula, on a machine, just crank it out, I think that's a wise approach.
There is one question: what could be the measures that Europe could take to reactivate the economy when interest rates are so low?
So that's
and I can add a second one that is related. Are you in favor? What do you think about negative rates? Would United States go for negative rates?
So I don't know.
The case being?
So I don't know what the United States would do. I'm a little uncomfortable with that. I think that that conceptually getting the public to understand exactly what was going on would be a significant challenge. In terms of what the ECB or anywhere else can do to spark more growth and more productivity, that's a complicated question because there are many different elements or components that contribute to robust growth. Innovation is one area that's important. Having the capacity to produce at higher levels, so making sure businesses have the capital they need, make sure businesses have the workers to execute that capital. So in the United States, we're having, I talked in my remarks about shortages of labor in many sectors. If you have shortages of labor, that is a natural constraint on how fast or how big you can grow. For me, the challenge is none of these things are within the purview of the U.S. Central Bank, right? So this will require the actions and activities of a whole bunch of other folks. Now, I'm happy to show them what my staff has shown, the things that we know about the history of economic performance, but ultimately, it's a political decision that governments across Europe and actually across the United States are still grappling with as to how to work through those things.
Another question is about the complications that could come from diverging monetary policy between the United States and other central banks. And I think this is an interesting question. How do you think about that? To what extent what happened in the interest rates in Europe influence your own decisions? So to what extent this is part of your process? And perhaps even more in detail, do you think that now you have started, but Europe has not started yet to raise rates, and it will take some time? But when both are doing the same movement, do you expect some kind of acceleration in financial tightening that could have a very important effect. So to what extent this is not linear? 1 plus 1 could be 3 or 4 in the interaction of different monetary policies.
Yeah, there's no reason to expect it to be linear, right? And this is one of the things with the balance sheet normalization, because it's a cumulative effect and not being the first actor, it's hard to predict ex ante how that will play out. I think in all of these spaces, we need to be mindful that it's a global economy, right? And that the things that happen in one part of the world have implications for other parts of the world. And that trend has increased dramatically over the last 40 or 50 years, right? So the need for us to be sensitive to these things is much greater. I don't think there is consensus in my group about exactly what a particular signal might mean for the U.S. Or what things we might do, how that will affect the European countries as well. And so we're working on this. Right? This is on some level. I've said this earlier today. Policy evolved to a place it had never been before. Right? We were in an unprecedented territory in terms of the responses that central banks needed to do across the world. So in this unprecedented environment, there's no reason why we should expect the things that happen in normal times to also happen in the unprecedented time. Right? So it requires more diligence in terms of paying attention to what developments are happening and trying to understand as close to real time as possible whether the reactions and responses of workers, families, and businesses are the same as they've been historically or have changed in fundamental ways. If we see changes or divergences that are significant, we really have to work hard to understand that, to make sure that we do not exacerbate a negative trend or are too passive so that the economy overheats, because the overheating typically leads to a violent and pretty dramatic contraction, and that kind of volatility is also not good. So we're trying to find a sweet spot, right? And that sweet spot is going to require us to really be on top of things as much as possible.
And we have seen examples of how monetary policy in one country moved, obviously, the bond market, but monetary policy in other countries also influenced the global bond market. Global bond market are really well integrated, so it's difficult to incorporate that in monetary policy. There is a question about who would be, how far is the neutral situation in the Fed? You already talked about that. They were asking also if you have any idea on the European case. Is it much farther away than the United States?
I don't know that for sure.
Tough question because...
yeah, I don't know that for sure. As I understand the demographics of Europe, they're more severely tilted towards aging of the economy, aging of the population. In that case, I would expect neutral to be a little lower than it would be in the U.S., but I have not studied that closely to know that for sure. So maybe I'll put an intern on that when I get back.
Someone would like you to develop a little bit further. What are the principal international financial stability risks that you see now at the global level, not just at the U.S. level, but at the global level? How do you see the international financial risks? And if I may add, how this influence your own thinking? You started to develop a little bit that, but perhaps a little bit more detail. Emerging markets have started to have some issues. Dollar moving up has tightened the financial conditions for a few countries that have started to suffer. How do you analyze that? What are the risks that you see there?
So there are many risks happening, like in many corners of the globe. So if you look at Argentina, for example, their relationship with the IMF and those policies, how that plays out has important implications for many institutions that operate in my district. So I have Miami is a big banking center and a link between the U.S. banking system, South America, And so Argentina's role there is significant. What happens in Venezuela and how that plays out, and in particular, the pressures that Venezuela and the exodus from the country places on the neighbors could have a significant implication for their ability to manage their economy. If you go to China, China is now injecting a lot of stimulus into their economy. There were questions 5 and 10 years ago about whether the amount of stimulus China was putting on was sustainable and whether there was going to be some bleeding over into other financial institutions. We're putting on a lot more now, so that risk is there for sure. In Europe, we have this situation with Italy and their budget and the amount of debt that they are proposing to take on and how that will play out from an EU perspective. Greece is still there. They have their issues. And then you have issues in the Middle East around what's going to happen with oil prices and the sustainability of the viability of new strategies that might be coming up. So there are risks that we're trying to monitor. Have I missed any continents? I think we got everywhere. There are just a lot of risks that we need to be mindful of. In terms of how this plays out for the U.S. economy, let me say it like this. Trade was an indirect notion for many of the constituents in my district. Businesses and families understood that they had heard people say we're part of a global economy, but what that really meant in terms of their day-to-day was not as clear. I think the developments that have happened through tariffs and trade and seeing businesses respond and seeing prices start to shift and hearing about the uncertainty has made real the reality that we're much more connected and interconnected, and that means that these risks are things that we're going to pay attention to, and I think more people will appreciate them, and that's ultimately the risk there, and there being so many is not a great thing, but that we're aware of them and we pay attention to them and we react and respond on time. That awareness is a great positive.
One question coming, I think, well, perhaps one related question, and I am coming back to the domestic arena, is the U.S. trade policies have been restrictive, is the question. Do you fear a pass-through to inflationary expectation? We already talked a little bit about that, but it's not just materializing in effects, direct effects, but just through expectations. To what extent you fear that this could happen?
So I've not seen any indication that that's imminent, right? But when I talk to business leaders, what they tell me is we don't know what the end game is. We don't know if this is a short-run negotiation that will revert back once whatever goals the U.S. has are achieved, or whether this is the new steady state. I think if this was understood to be the new steady state, then we'd have issues potentially around inflation expectations. But I haven't seen those yet, and so I'm not in any of the negotiating rooms to know exactly where this is likely to go. So all I can do is watch with everyone else and just be ready to respond as policy becomes clearer.
Again, on domestic, have you any concern that the U.S. economy has peaked and could face headwinds next year as fiscal stimulus fades and previous Fed rate? Well, I don't read it very well, but that's basically the question. What is your fear in terms of slowing down? And after the United States, I would like to see your views on the global situation, to what extent this is peaked. And perhaps the question is, how well prepared are we for the next downturn? I don't know when it will happen, but how well.
So hopefully not while I'm still in this chair, right? So
in this chair, don't worry, no, but
in any chair in this capacity, all right? So what I tell people is, my goal is for there not to be a recession while I am a part of the Federal Reserve System. Right? That's my goal, and so I'm going to do all I can to make sure that doesn't happen. In terms of the path of the U.S. economy, thank you very much. In terms of the path of the U.S. economy, I would say my model, my team, and my view is that the U.S. will return to its long-run capacity potential, which is somewhere in the 1.8 to 2% range in 2021, something in that space. Now, that assumes that nothing changes in terms of the U.S. capacity. And this is where going back to the business investment becomes important. Because if businesses invest in ways that increase the productivity of the workforce, that increases our capacity without putting upward pressure on inflation. Right? So I'm looking pretty intensely to see if we're seeing signs of those sorts of investments. Because if that happens, then my long-run forecast will change. We've not seen that to date, but there are reasons why we might have expected not to see it. So the tax changes that we had were far more complicated than I think most businesses expected. And so many businesses are still just figuring out what it means for them and what it means for their investment strategies. We talked about the uncertainty in the trade space, which is delaying a lot of activity. So it may be that we're not going to see signs of, or the evidence to suggest whether those investments are happening for some time. So I think we got a couple years where the economy is going to perform above potential. It will slowly go down. My hope is that our policies will facilitate an easy path that is not disruptive. But I do leave open the possibility that there are going to be some things that happen on the business side that increase the productivity of our workforce. And if that happens, then we could be in a much stronger economic position.
So your idea would be that the fiscal stimulus fading will not disturb this path towards some kind of equilibrium. Is that what you are saying?
Sure.
Yeah.
So what we know is that the fiscal stimulus, particularly on the consumer side and the household side, is going to phase out. Right? And so as it phases out, the extra benefits you get from that are just going to disappear unless something else happens. So I'm focusing on the something else to see if those things are happening, which will then allow me to change my forecast. But as of right now, to the extent that these stimulus tools are not going to be here in 2020, then I can't have any added bump to GDP because of those things, because they won't be there. So yes, the fade will happen absent some positive investments.
I have a question that is different, and will be the last question from the public, but I have still a few more questions just in case someone wants to ask something else.
This is the moderator's prerogative.
Yes,
right?
Exactly.
You all should get this job, right?
They are asking a little bit about deregulation and what is happening in the area of deregulation in the United States. And I guess it's financial deregulation, but it could be broader than that, because the next side of the question is to what extent deregulation is creating more flexibility or a slack in the economy. So how do you look at that?
So when I think, actually
I mixed a lot of things.
That went two different places.
Yes.
I thought you were talking about one thing, and now I think you may be talking about something else. So I'll answer both questions. So in general, when we think about regulation, the way I think about the regulatory environment is like a pendulum, right? And there'll be a period where it's too loose, and then things happen. It's like, oh no, we got to stop that. And then it swings, and it gets a little too tight. It's like, oh, it's too tight. You're squelching activity, and so then we got to ease it up a little bit, and it swings back. And so we're it's in continual flux, right? And then this industry responds to regulation as well, and so it's an ongoing effort that way. The question always is, how do you know if you've gone too far in one way or too far in the other way? And the answer is experience, right? So you just pick a place to go, and then you see what happens. And then when that happens, we say, oh, we're about right. Oh, we're still not far enough, or we went too far. And so that's the exercise we're in now. I will say I thought that many of the changes that came out of the crisis for the United States, and actually it had global implications, stress tests for banks, increasing capital requirements in a significant way, those things were good for our financial system. They were good for our financial resilience, and that's a good thing. That makes me sleep better at night. The banks will tell you, and financial institutions more broadly will say, we can operate more with less of those requirements in place and still be safe and still operate in a prudent way. And so the question is, how much do you believe that? All right. So we have people in our group who are comfortable with those arguments, and we're going to see. And I agree with some things. There are other things where experience will show one way or the other. But we will see. And that's the exercise that we're doing on the banking system. Now, there's another side, which is the regulatory more broadly for business.
Yes.
Right? And in my district, right when I started, I went around and started talking to people. And they would all say, business people in general, the government hates business. Right? They just want to regulate everything. They don't want us to have any ideas. They don't want us to be able to innovate in any way. And it was causing them to not even try. At least that's what they were telling me. So their view, and one of the reasons why we've seen, I think, a robust pickup in consumer confidence, in business confidence, and sentiment, is because there's a feeling that they are more free to do the things that they need to do. Now, just as I said in the banking system, this is a pendulum, right? So it could be that some of the deregulation is going to move too far, and bad things could happen. But we are seeing, I think, businesses be willing to invest in at levels that they weren't before. And I will say, right after the election where Trump was elected, like the next day the stock market went up a lot. Business sentiment went up a lot, and no policies had changed. Investments started happening, and there is a psychological element to the economy that we all need to be sensitive to and acknowledge. And so I think this deregulation, on balance, so far, has contributed to an increase in our economic activity. The question is, and you never know until you know, are there some things that actually went too far that we're going to have to sort of reset to try to get to more of a balance?
Yeah, I must say I fully agree with you, particularly on the financial side. I think I have changed positions, but I have not changed my mind yet. I think that it was very important to have a strong regulation, particularly as far as capital, as far as the cautions, because we will be facing unexpected problems ahead. This will always happen, so the road ahead of us is always bumpy. I think it's important to have this kind of thing. Perhaps you can question some of the details and some of the small things that could be, need to be explored. There is always a reason behind any of these details, and if you have been in these tables, you will see that any time that you sit and you try to reduce one of these details, you get three of them.
Right.
I mean, you remove one, you get three more. So it's not easy, but as far as basic things like having a lot of capital, etc., I think we are in a much better place. And given the uncertainties that we face, I think it would be wrong to scale back some of this progress that has been made.
So I'll just say, in the U.S. system, we have twice as much capital in banks that we did pre-crisis. Right, that's a lot of extra capital. There's a lot of extra cushion, and then the stress test thing. One thing I think we learned, I think many people were surprised, a lot of banks had not really thought deeply about, are they ready to deal with a real hard time, right? And so this stress test is really designed to say, you have to think about this. This is not optional. You need to be extremely thoughtful about, if really bad things happen, are you prepared? Can you survive? Because so much of the TARP and all that was, we don't think you can survive. Right? We have to get you levels of capital in emergency context so you survive. And that's not the time to be making these assessments. Right? You should do that in advance, be prepared, and the stress test is really designed to do that. So both of them, I think, were exactly on point, and we just need to make sure that the underlying objectives don't get lost as we go through our deregulatory episode.
And in fact, today the binding constraint in terms of capital is not so much the regulation, is the stress test. Is the CCAR that is raising in United States and also in Europe is more the stress test than really the minimum regulation, which is lower than that, and banks are already above that. So another group of questions that I would like to ask you is about monetary policy and the future, the lessons of the instruments and the monetary policy after using very new set of instruments. I think I would like to understand a little bit how do you see QE after all the experiment of using QE when there was really no much instruments to use because interest rate had hit the bottom, and also forward guidance. But let me start with QE. What is your final assessment after that, after using QE? Is this the tool for the future? Is it the tool for occasional use in the future? Is it part of the toolkit, or is it something that, if possible, is better not to use? What is your approach to that?
So my general approach on this is everything should be part of the toolkit because I can't anticipate what's coming. And if I don't know what's coming, I don't want to put some tools that might be useful to the side and say I'm never going to use that. So to me, everything should be in play. I think QE was actually a good thing to do. I think it proved to be effective, and in terms of the market impact, but also from a psychological perspective. I talked about the psychology, and like in those days, 2008, 2009, the American public was scared. They were worried, and they weren't sure that the institutions were going to be there for them. And I think that the move for QE was a sign, we're going to do things that you've never seen before because we're going to be there for you. And I think that the public interpreted it that way, and that was quite helpful. So it needs to be in the toolkit, but all I can say is the response that will be required will be fully dependent on the forces that require that response, right? So in the last crisis, it was housing and liquidity in housing markets and bank. So the response needed to have some housing elements and other elements to it. The next time, if it's, I don't know, land or energy or whatever, then the response needs to speak to those things directly. So it's very difficult in advance to tell you what the tool is going to look like, what the strategy is going to look like, because I don't know what the source of the problem is going to look like. But so the response just needs to be tailored in that way, so we do that. The other thing I'll say is, even if I did know, I'm not going to tell you, because we need, in these times, the policy to be something of a surprise, right? And so if we tell you all what the policy is going to be in the future, then you're going to make your decisions and your response to that now. Right? And so when we deploy it, it won't have the effect that you'd want it to have because everyone had already incorporated that into their decision making. Right? So we need to make sure we don't give away the farm so that when we do our policy, it's on point and it drives decisions to occur in a different way. Right? And so I want to give you confidence. I will support taking actions to respond to things as necessary, and in a way that drives decision-making at businesses, by families, by workers, in the right direction and in directions toward improvement.
A colleague of yours said that it doesn't work in theory, but it works in practice. No? So you think it works?
Yeah, I don't make those distinctions.
Okay.
The theory, practice, right?
But the question would be, to what extent complicates your communication afterwards?
It complicates communication a lot, right? So communication is hard. And this is one thing. I'm an economist by training. We don't get trained to communicate. We get trained to write papers that show up in technical journals that only other economists can understand. But in this instance, when we're dealing with these kind of policies, we need to be able to talk about why we're doing what we're doing, why we think it's the appropriate thing to do, and give some sense of how it's going to affect you when we do it, right? So that everybody understands where we're trying to get to, and that's hard. That's particularly hard for people.
And in the exit.
No, you don't. So eventually you have to get there, but at the time of policy deployment, no one's thinking about the exit. But everyone's just thinking about, am I going to be around next week? Am I going to have my house? Am I going to have my job? And we'll worry about the exit down the road. There may be politicians that worry about the implications for this, but in terms of the sentiment, I think in general that just gets swamped by the energy of the moment, that the fear and the tension of the moment. And so when you start, you need to have some idea about the exit, but that I don't think should be the emphasis of the policy in those first moments. Now, you'll have time as you do it to figure those things out, but if we don't communicate clearly, if I don't communicate clearly and my colleagues, that confusion could undermine our ability to really get us out of things. And I think you saw some of that. I mean, it wasn't the Fed per se, but just in getting to TARP, the reaction of the Congress in this, and many other attitudes that still prevail about the appropriateness of doing those sorts of bailouts. Part of that was communication and how it was presented that created resentment that we're still living with today.
So what about forward guidance? What is your assessment of forward guidance?
Forward guidance is great.
It's great.
Right? So it served a purpose. When you're in a context where you're doing things in policy that have never been done before, one of the objectives that you have to have is, why are we doing it and where are we going? Right? And because uncertainty in the policy, I talked about this with trade policy. If you have uncertainty in policy, then people won't act. Right? They will wait. They will forbear, and they will try to let things clarify before actions get taken. So that forward guidance was very effective, I think, in saying, okay, it started off, we're going to keep rates low for as long as necessary. Then we're going to start rising rates until we see signs of, then we're going to normalize. And so the way that it's gone is to try to show the path, to minimize the amount of uncertainty that is in the monetary policy space, so that decision makers in board rooms and around the dinner table kind of have a sense of what it's going to be like 3 months from now and 12 months from now. Because when you do that, then you can make a plan. Right? And that's kind of what you needed to get to. Well, where we are now, we're well off the lower bound. We're not at zero anymore. And so forward guidance becomes more difficult. Because once the economy is standing on its own, then I don't know in advance whether we're going to need more stimulus, have a more accommodative policy, or whether we're going to need to contract. And so what you've seen over the last several months is we've been removing forward guidance language from our statements when we announce our policies because it becomes less appropriate. It would actually signal a certainty that we don't believe we have about what the next policy step would be needed. And when you're at zero, it's pretty easy. You're going to go up, right? But now we're in the middle zone, so you could go up or you could go down. And so forward guidance in that environment becomes really difficult, and sometimes it could even be counterproductive.
There have been other ideas floated, for example, to move the inflation objective or the inflation level that you feel comfortable. How do you feel about that? Do you think that we should start to be thinking that perhaps it's better to have 4% in the future as a kind of level that you feel comfortable, so that we have more room to go down when necessary? Is that something that appeals you?
So there's been a lot of conversation on this. I would say moving the inflation target makes me very nervous.
I'm glad to hear that.
We took a long we did, and all this was before I got here, but there was a lot of effort made to get everyone to understand what the current target is. Right? A lot of effort. If a change then triggered a notion that, well, this target is going to move it to 4%, but they may change their mind in 18 months and go to 3.25% or 5.5%. Right? That then undermines the whole notion, the stability of inflation expectations. It undermines the notion of the long-run perspective and the stability of policy. And I think it makes it much more difficult to execute a policy that's going to be effective on a consistent basis. So I wouldn't be in favor of that. But one thing that I think is useful to do is to ask the question every now and then, right? To say, okay, we made some decisions 5, 10 years ago. How did they do? Are we comfortable with those decisions today? So we're not just locked into policy because that's what we did before, but we're locked in, and then we regain a consensus and comfort with the policy space, and then we can adjust as possible. But I think it's useful to be thinking about these questions on a regular basis. So I'm having conversations with my team now. I wrote a blog. If you're not already on, you should follow the macro blog for the Atlanta Fed. I had to do my commercial. And I did a blog about price level targeting. Right, so instead of maybe 2% all the time, maybe you say we want a long-run trajectory for prices, put some bounds around it, and as long as the prices are in that bound as you move forward, we're okay, right? And on average, it'll still be at 2%, but this question about, which we face today, if our target's 2% and we get to 2.1, do we tighten? And the answer may be no, because we don't have that kind of position. If we get to 2.3, do we tighten? And so that then becomes, a day on CNBC or whatever about how are we going to execute our policy in these spaces. And so thinking about this and weighing the costs and benefits of the different approaches, picking a point and saying that's our point versus picking a range and saying that's our range, it's good to have that conversation from time to time. So you should read the blog. It's a four-parter. It's very good. So it's accessible. We try to do that.
So now that you mentioned 2.1, 2.2, what do you think about overshooting inflation as an offset of inflation being for a long time below the objective? Do you think that there is some argument, some rationale behind that?
I'm comfortable with that, right? So I mean, if we went to like 4% inflation, that would be one thing. But if we're at 2.2,
yeah, well, that's
right. The idea that we have that kind of the power to be that precise in these sorts of trends, I think, is an illusion. And so I wouldn't worry too much about that. To me, I'm looking about broad-based, significant upward pricing pressures. And 2.2 probably isn't going to be that broad. Now, if it's 2.2 to 2.5 to 2.8, right, if you start to see that kind of trend, that to me might be a different signal. But we're not seeing anything like that, so I'm not that concerned at this point.
So my final two questions, which are different from the previous ones. One is another consequence of the amount of unconventional monetary policy that has been used and different instruments is that some of the barriers with other policies have been blurred. And there has been some, I would say, emerging concern about the independence of central banks. And some have started to argue that if central banks are doing that many things, it doesn't make sense to have this kind of independence. These are very close to some policy decisions that should be done by the Treasury or whoever is the... So what do you think about the independence of central banks today in this new world, and to what extent you are seeing these kind of pressures, and to what extent is a concern of yours?
So independence of central bank is an everyday concern of mine. I think independence has been one of the hallmarks that's allowed us to be effective.
I agree.
People view our institution differently because we have a separate mission, and we're insulated so that we are not expected to be responding to a headline that occurs every day or every hour. And that gives us a luxury to think differently about how the economy is functioning and what incentives need to be in place and how our policies should be deployed. I think that's incredibly important. I'll just stop there. Now, in terms of the idea that the new policies that we've been incorporating have changed the perception of the Fed or the central banks more generally as more activist institutions, I think that's fair, right? So I was at the Fed in the Greenspan years, right? And in those years, they had a meeting every 6 weeks. They didn't really have a statement, and it was just in the background. And it was, I mean, not really in the background, but the idea that we were engaging in policy the way the Congress might engage in policy or the president might engage, they're just totally different. The crisis changed that, and many of the things that we chose to do required day-to-day tweaking. Now you're going to buy some securities here, you're going to buy some securities there, you're going to do all these sorts of things, and now it feels like you guys are just like we are. Those are the Congress. What's the difference really in that space? And this, to me, is where communication becomes critical, right? So how we talk about our policies and how we explain it to other policymakers becomes critically important. And so I have a goal, personally, to meet with every elected official in Washington in my district. Because I want them to know who I am, I want them to know the things I'm worrying about, and I want them to understand the whys behind what we're doing. So there's no illusion that we are trying to usurp the ideas, the authorities, or the goals of elected officials. I have no interest in doing that. I don't want to be in those debates in the Congress. I'll leave that to them. But I have to be true to our mission and our mandate, which is stable prices and maximum sustainable employment. And we need to be free enough to do those things that we think can achieve that in whatever circumstance or whatever environment that prevails. And so I'm going to impress upon anyone who will listen, that's my mandate. I'm going to take that seriously. And to the extent that we can, we're going to do it.
Final question. What do you think about cryptocurrencies? What do you think about Bitcoin? But most importantly, what do you think about the debate about central banks issuing themselves some kind of crypto money, crypto dollar?
So I was hoping I would escape without this one. So
it's not a difficult one.
You don't think so?
I don't think so. Well,
I want to hear your answer now.
Okay, I will answer.
So my take on the crypto space in general is that the way that the technology has been deployed is not really conducive to it going to scale. So if you think about the Bitcoin market, there's an article in the Wall Street Journal today, it's lost 60% of its value this calendar year. Right. To the extent that any of these instruments has that kind of value volatility, the notion that it could be consistent currency, I think, is pretty not likely. Right? So to the extent that these technologies are deployed in spaces and in ways that are going to continue to lead to that kind of volatility, it's not going to get to a scale where it can be credibly viewed as a replacement for all the other ways that we do payments. So that would be a baseline view. But technology changes every day. And there are many people who are working to understand or to imagine ways to deploy it that will have different qualities and characters to it. So I know that here in Europe, there's been a lot of discussion around this, trying to categorize and classify different sorts of applications. I think that makes a lot of sense. I do worry, and this is a more general worry about innovation, that a lot of times we talk much more about the positive potentiality than the risks that might be exposed. And I worry that as we go down this road, I hope that there's a lot of attention that's given to, well, what risks might we be introducing to the system? But in principle, I'm happy to be trying to understand this as much as possible and move forward. So Atlanta has been working to make itself a center of financial technology, so it'd be a fintech center. There are dozens of companies there that are trying to deploy technologies, and I'm trying as much as possible to work with them, to understand what they think they're going to do, how that's going to work. And I always poke them, like, remember risk, right? Because if you come and try to plug into our payment system and haven't thought about risk, we're going to have a problem. But I don't think that it's appropriate to say no to technology, because technology is coming whether I want it to or not. And so the question is, how can we move forward together to try to make sure we have a system that works for the average person?
I agree. I agree with that. I think in terms of bitcoins and cryptocurrencies, not still a financial issue or a financial stability issue that is very relevant, but we need to keep attention and need to see how this develop. In terms of central banks moving towards some kind of crypto issuance, I would say you have to be extremely careful, think twice, think 4 times, think 5 times, look at all the consequences. There could be huge and not positive consequences coming from that, and this should be explored before anyone moves in that direction. So that was, I don't think it was not a difficult question. So I would like to thank you very much for all this. I hope that you will stay in your chair for a long time, if only not to have any kind of downturn. And I would like to thank you very much for this openness to discuss all these issues and for all your views. And I would like to ask you to join me in thanking you.